We'll get started. If everybody's ready, welcome everyone to this forum. Can you hear me okay and see me okay? Yep, good. Welcome everyone to this forum initiated by Socialist Alliance on Australia's war crimes from Afghanistan to West Papua. It is being live streamed on Green Left via YouTube. My name is Chloe. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Boon Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I would like to start this forum by acknowledging and paying respects to the elders of this country, past, present, and future generations, and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. And we also recognize that the struggle against colonization, the genocide, and the dispossession of Aboriginal and First Nations is ongoing, and connected with the struggles against brutal imperial wars and border imperialism and the racist capitalism that we are all now living under. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We decided to hold this forum in the wake of the horrific revelations of war crimes and the shocking response by the Australian government in relation to those war crimes committed by Australia's Special Air Forces soldiers, the SAS. The crimes the SAS committed were sadistic. We're talking acts such as slitting the throats of children. There are likely to be many more crimes like this that will never be reported. And as some of you know, the government's response was to say that these terrible attacks on civilians, on children and prisoners were just because of a few bad people in the SAS. We know that's the government's doing it. That's the government doing its best to deflect public anger onto just a few individual soldiers for these atrocities, just so they can stop people from calling for the SAS to be disbanded. And that's why we're focusing on Afghanistan and West Papua. It's not just a few soldiers. There is a pattern of war crimes by Australian soldiers by either carrying out war crimes themselves or training others to carry them out. The SAS and the Australian Federal Police have a history over decades of training the worst of the Indonesian security forces. They have been using death squads and paramilitary units against the Indonesian pro-democracy movement and the East Timorese independence campaign, and now against the West Papuan population. The SAS must be disbanded. I would now like to introduce the speakers for tonight. We will be having all the speakers talk first, and then afterwards we will have an opportunity for some discussion and we can take questions from the floor. I'm just going to make sure, because we did have a speaker that was running a bit late, and I'm not sure if he's here. Okay, I don't see him.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, you're there.
Yeah, I joined you through audio call because I'm calling from Afghanistan, and here internet the speed is slow. That's why I have to use only audio. If I use video, then I will be disconnected.
Thank you so much for confirming that you're there. So we're just going to announce the speakers in order. Pip Hinman, who is from Socialist Alliance in Sydney and is one of the founding members of Sydney Stop the War Coalition. And also you just heard before, we are also especially privileged to have someone speaking from Afghanistan tonight from the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan, Ubaid Kabir. And then we have activist Ronnie Kareni representing the West Papuan community. And lastly, we have Jacob Grutch, an anti-war campaigner and renegade activist based here in Melbourne. And both Pip Hinman and Jacob Grutch were key figures in organising the original anti-war protests, the protest to stop the invasion of Afghanistan almost 20 years ago. And on that note, I would like to now call on our first speaker, Pip Hinman. Thank you, Pip.
Thanks, Chloe. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And I acknowledge that we are, their land was never ceded and their sovereignty was never ceded. I'm especially happy to have Ubaid on this Zoom call today because we need to hear from Afghans whose voices have been largely silenced in Australia. So
thank you, Pip.
Thank you for coming on. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. Until just a few days ago, the Australian government was reeling from the public findings of the Brereton report, which, as everyone knows, was very heavily redacted, which was investigating Australian Special Forces war crimes in Afghanistan. And then it seemed like there was a spat beginning between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Defence, because they seem to be emphasising different aspects of the report, including what action to take as a result. Now the political battleground has shifted again to something that's way more convenient for our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. It's become an issue of Australia versus China, since China released a Photoshop tweet of an Australian soldier apparently slitting the throat of a child in Afghanistan. So shifting the political outrage away from war crimes has been very useful for Scott Morrison. It helps him muster patriotic support for a war which has long ceased to make any sense to most people. But as you probably all know already, this report's been about 4.5 years in the making. The General, Angus Campbell, commissioned a New South Wales Supreme Court judge and an Army Reserve Major, Paul Brereton, to undertake this inquiry, which has only just been released after 4.5 years. Now, it's found evidence that there have been 39 murders of civilians and prisoners by or at the instruction of members of Australia's Special Forces. And these murders were subsequently covered up by the ADF. Some of the people who were killed were also tortured. While the report has, of course, major flaws, not least which that, the number of killings and murders have been minimised, the other, of course, major flaw is the fact that it abrogates responsibility for superior levels of defence who apparently didn't know this was all going on. Nevertheless, the fact is the report has generated a huge discussion around Afghanistan that we haven't seen in this country in a long time. Okay, Campbell has been insisting that one of the report's recommendations is that the 39 victims' families must be compensated financially. And this needed to happen if the Australian Defence Force was to maintain any shred of credibility. He also said that the Special Operations Task Group responsible for these criminal acts need to be stripped of their merit unit citation. So Morrison initially balked at the whole compensation to victims' families, and he also then appeared very non-committal on removing the award. But since this China tweet has changed the narrative in Australia, Morrison's changed his tune. And started to round on the fact that we couldn't possibly take away, meritorious awards because this would be, quote unquote, procedural unfairness. Not all 3,000 SAS troops have committed a crime, is what veterans groups and even a former MP, a Labor MP who's a former commando, he said it would be cruel to strip the honour from those who have not done anything wrong. So Morrison has seized on this opportunity to push the political narrative back. So really this fake photo, whatever it doesn't really matter, from China's foreign ministry has provided Morrison with an excuse to use a nationalist charged diversion tactic. And since then, he's been on the warpath against China, one of many, demanding that it apologise. Of course, it's not going to. So look, this might seem irrelevant to the bigger picture of this long-running illegal war, but I've started here because I wanted to demonstrate what I think is happening, which is that the ruling class in Australia is a bit split on what to do in Afghanistan and how to handle the public opprobrium about Australia's war crimes. I mean, in 1991, they were lockstep with the war on terror, which meant that we had to invade, occupy Afghanistan, to bring down one man, Osama bin Laden, who incidentally was a friend of the West, but was no longer a friend of the West. So he had apparently orchestrated the whole 9/11 terror attack on the US. Well, I mean, people were in shock, I remember at the time, but, you know, the two major parties went along with it, and, you know, that meant that a lot of people were going along with it as well. Well, Socialist Alliance, the party I'm with, opposed the war, and we campaigned with many others against Australia entering the war. We continued to oppose it even after the United Nations deemed it illegal, which was a month or so later after the invasion. And we've done what we can to build the anti-war/peace movement activism over the last 20 years by challenging lies and seizing every opportunity we could to try and mobilise people. But the movement in Australia against the war in Afghanistan was hard to build, and it remained relatively small, largely, I think, and we can talk about this more in discussion, because the major parties both supported the war. They accepted the lies about the war bringing democracy and women's rights. The voices of Afghans was entirely missing. And so as a result of that, we made a point of speaking as much as possible to Afghans where we could in the democratic movement. Malalai Joya, we helped bring her to Australia twice during the last couple of decades. People who don't know Malalai Joya, she's a very significant figure in Afghanistan in the democratic rights movement. And when she came to Australia, she had a very important message for international audiences. She said, we can deal with the war, with the warlords, the terror groups, the puppet governments. We can deal with them politically, but we can't do that at the same time the West has its occupation forces in the country. So Malalai was a popularly elected MP from the western province of Farah, which is right next to the border of Iran. She had to step down after receiving death threats from warlords after she'd crossed them in Parliament. She's an extremely brave woman, like many democracy activists in Afghanistan. But she said to us, and she kept reminding us every time she came here, don't believe the West's propaganda. The US and its allies will only want to install puppet regimes. They're not going to be delivering any democracy. Well, she didn't need to convince us, but she did have an impact on a lot of other people who were, I don't know, in two minds maybe about what should be done. We know the Western occupation troops have destroyed much of Afghanistan's infrastructure, and we know now that they're starting to pillage its resources. As an aside, I've just noticed that Twiggy Forrester of Fortescue Metals, who's a huge mining magnate in Australia, has just visited Afghanistan to stitch up some deals. The way the business press here puts it is to get a political foothold in a resource-rich nation. So you can see the plunder continues. Certainly you would have to say the West has not won the war. And of course, Ubaid from the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan will be able to comment further on how Afghanistan is dealing with the situation now. Suffice to say that at the very least, Australia has a moral obligation to send war reparations, not to the puppet government, but to civil society groups who are trying to reconstruct the country. Well, most Australians were never privy to seeing exactly how the war unfolded in Afghanistan, but we did get a little glimpse via the few Hazara refugees who managed to make it into Australia. And you know that there are millions of people were displaced and have been displaced from this war into Pakistan, Iran, and some of them are now coming back. The war in this country was cast as the good war, whereas the war in Iraq was cast as the bad war. Nevertheless, you'd have to say that there is still a broad-based anti-war sentiment in Australia. Now, when the ABC reporter Dan Oakes and his colleagues revealed what a former ADF lawyer, David McBride, had given them, actual footage about war crimes in Afghanistan, people were shocked. The Afghan files shocked people, not because we thought Australian soldiers were so good and pure, thanks Chloe, would never do such a thing, but we were shocked because we hadn't seen what was going on in Afghanistan. They only revealed this after reports had already been tabled with authorities here about potential war crimes. We know this because a sociologist by the name of Samantha Cromverts tabled a report in January 2016 about potential war crimes in Afghanistan, and this became actually the catalyst for the Brereton inquiry. Some of the quotes from her report, I have it here, I can't read it out, I don't have time, are quite incredible. SAS people that went to speak to her. All right, so Australia's combat troops were withdrawn from Afghanistan in 2013, but we're still there occupying and training Afghan nationals under a NATO command. Some 26,000 Australian soldiers have served in Afghanistan and 41 have died. The cost of this war is pretty hard to find, actually, on the ADF website. The only figure I had, maybe Jacob knows more, is as of mid-September 10 years ago, 2010, Australia had spent $6.1 billion, so maybe double that. Australia joined this war because of its deputy sheriff status to the US and imperialism's interest in this part of the world. And while the war on terror propaganda has disappeared, largely because I think they know that we know that nothing like this has happened. In fact, it's helped terror groups morph into new terror groups. The US, ironically, is drawing down its troops under the Trump administration. I think that is an admission that the war is very unpopular. Australia knows that as well. But then, of course, they have their proxies, and they will keep the tension simmering while they try and thwart any real moves for democracy. And that's why our solidarity is still very critical. And I'll end it, nearly finished here. We're joining with those that are saying that all of Australia's troops should come out of Afghanistan right now, because while they stay, they continue to provide the political legitimacy to the US NATO command and the ADF, and it gives legitimacy to the ADF and the SAS. And of course, being there undermines the movement for self-determination. We're also supporting the call for the SAS to be completely disbanded. And the war criminals who authorised the war, not just the people that carried it out, that includes prime ministers from both major parties, they need to be brought to justice. All right, well, the Brereton report claims that Australian officers and office bearers and higher ups in the ADF just were not in a position to know. That is such bullshit when it's easy to find Samantha's report on the internet. You can download it from January 2016. But we know that this is a class-divided society and bits of paper are just not going to cut it in terms of changing policy. That's why we have to keep up pressure in the streets, and we have to, the best movement for solidarity that we can do now for our friends in Afghanistan is to keep the pressure on our political leaders here. That's why we need to do what we can to build the anti-war networks, to defend the whistleblowers, and to insist that the war criminals at the top are brought to justice. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pip, and thank you to all the other activists like you who have been raising their voices, building our anti-war networks against the invasion of Afghanistan, and to all those who keep fighting for justice and for the people of Afghanistan. I would like to now introduce Ubaid Kabir, who is speaking with us from Afghanistan. Ubaid is a member of the Solidarity Party of Afghanistan, the SPA, which is a progressive left-wing political party in Afghanistan. It is a party that is known for its protests around the country and its uncompromising and outspoken politics in their struggle for freedom, independence, democracy, and social justice. One of their objectives is the immediate withdrawal of US NATO occupation forces from Afghanistan. Ubaid has also been leading the cultural committee of this party for years. Ubaid, we welcome you. I hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much to Green Left for arranging this meeting, and also especially special thanks to Mr. Peter and Jacob. Sorry, I don't remember your second name, for being in contact with me and arranging everything. Well, I will not go into too much detail about the Australian military crimes in Afghanistan, because you're already in the picture and you know a lot about it, and most of the points has been already said in the media and also in the court. Just to give you a quick introduction, that after Afghanistan was occupied by US and NATO forces, of course, Australia was part of that, and these big countries who were part of the NATO and who were involved in Afghanistan, like 42 countries, they divided Afghanistan provinces amongst themselves. For example, Australians had responsibility for Oregon, which is a southwestern province, and Kandahar was given to Canada, or Herat was given to Italy, and or Mazar, which is in the north of the country, was given to Germans. But US, because they were the big boss, so they were present in every province, and they had control in the major provinces. First of all, because, for example, Kabul was mostly controlled by the US, or other provinces which had lots of importance strategically, or they were earning a lot from it. For example, Helmand. Helmand is the base or the main source of opium for in the whole Afghanistan. So British and US were always trying to have control over this province. And then Kandahar was also very much important province, and always Canadians and US, even they had fight amongst themselves to have control over these provinces. But apparently they made a kind of group or a committee, which they used to call it Provincial Rehabilitation Team, or PRTs. But of course they want to have the control over the province, and so they can earn from it. In the media, we always hear that more than $120 billion was given in form of aid and military to Afghanistan. But and most of the time, most of this money, we can say that over 50% of this money didn't come to Afghanistan at all, because they were making contracts with the big, especially US companies, and most of the money was going back to US. This is one point. And then most of the money was used by the military forces. Like the figures show that every foreign military force in Afghanistan, they had around $15,000 US they were spending every month on each troop. And then the rest of the money was given to the warlords. Just to give you an example, for example, Australia was investing on one of the warlords, Matiullah Khan. He was from Oregon, and this warlord, he used to be just a simple taxi driver, but within 3 or 4 years, he became the biggest mafia, the kingpin, and everything in that area. Apparently, he was the police chief of Oregon province, but he had control over everything. Like, he was the guy who was saying who should be the governor of the province or not, because the governor post is more important than a police chief. But like, he was the guy who was deciding who should have the control. And there are lots of reports of the crimes. For example, on 15th April 2015, the AIM network, they reported that Matiullah Khan military has been involved in mass murder, rape, abductions of men and women, and many other crimes that were committed by him and his men. Or there is another incident where he killed 80 people, 5 of them by shooting, and then with the rest of them, they killed them with the knives in a meeting, or other crimes that they committed. So if I talk about the current situation of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was occupied in the name of bringing liberation to the women and bringing democracy, bringing to justice, and other beautiful terminologies. But in reality, if we see the current situation, now, beside Taliban, we have 23 other terrorist groups active in Afghanistan. ISIS, Haqqani Network, and other small terrorist groups like from Uzbekistan, from Tajikistan, from other areas. They are active in Afghanistan and they are committing crimes here. And the ironic point about is that all of these terrorist groups, either they are supported by the big imperialist countries such as US, British, or Russia, China, or they are supported by the reactionary regional countries like Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, Uzbekistan. All of them, they have their own proxy troops in Afghanistan which are fighting for their aim. For example, currently, Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting their war in Afghanistan. India and Pakistan, they are fighting their war in Afghanistan, and other countries like even China and US are fighting their war in Afghanistan. Russia and US are fighting their war in Afghanistan. Iran is supporting Taliban at the same time, and then another group of Taliban are supported by the US. And then, so the victim of all of these crimes, war, and bloodshed are the Afghan people, especially women and children. And if you see the current situation that because US claimed that they will end up Taliban, but now we see from the, as you already know, that there is a peace, so-called peace negotiation is going on in Qatar, in Doha. And we can see every day that Taliban are getting stronger. There are many reasons for that. First of all, these Taliban are supported by the foreign troops because they want to justify their presence in Afghanistan. Because you know that most of the time the US imperialist government, to justify its presence in a country, they always want to have a kind of virtual enemy. We have seen the example of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or other countries that the US has invaded, and then they try to find a virtual enemy so they can justify their presence. The same is happening in Afghanistan. And because they want to end up the project of Taliban, now they're trying to do lots of propaganda for the ISIS because they want to fool out their own citizens, and then they want to fool out the rest of the world that Taliban are ending, but then another terrorist group is coming out and we should be there so we can fight against them. And second thing, that for the Taliban to become stronger is the crime committed by the foreign troops. Just you gave the example of Australian troops. The same is happening with the Germans. They have committed crimes. It has happened with the French, with the British, with the Italians. Some of them has been reported in the media, or especially they have become reported in the international media, but the rest of them has been there, but nobody has talked about them. And of course, US, they have committed many crimes. So this is the reason that they want to push people towards Taliban. And of course, there is another reason, because there is a, we can say, lack of progressive forces and individuals in Afghanistan, because most of them, they were killed during the Soviet Union occupation of Afghanistan. Most of them, the Soviet forces or the Russian forces, they killed most of the progressive and leftists. And at the same time, the warlords, like the jihadi parties, which were supported by CIA and ISI of Pakistan, they killed lots of intellectuals and progressive forces and individuals. So currently, that's the reason that there is a gap that Taliban can easily recruit people so they can continue their war. And then, of course, now with the peace negotiation which is going on, from the very first days when it was announced that Taliban are going to have a peace negotiation with the US, we said that there will be no peace in Afghanistan until and unless we have the foreign troops in Afghanistan. Apparently the US government is saying, especially recently, even Trump announced that they will be leaving Afghanistan, but we don't believe that because they just want to make an excuse because of the election which was going on the US. So they just brought Taliban on the peace table, but otherwise they will be there. And we believe that the foreign troops will leave Afghanistan when our people will stand up and fight them. When we say stand up and fight them, we mean that they are represented and they are led by progressive forces and not by reactionary forces such as Taliban. So this is the other reason that there will be no peace, because unless the US and NATO forces are there, because they want to use Afghanistan as a ground against other countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and then they will not sit quiet. They already have their proxy forces in Afghanistan, and every day we see lots of suicide bombings, we see lots of attacks on military posts and things like that, and they are supported by the other countries. They want to have war here, so because they don't want to have their rival country present in Afghanistan. So we always say that the US and other NATO countries should leave Afghanistan, and additionally they should start supporting the warlords, because even if they leave Afghanistan but they continue with supporting the warlords, of course the war and the bloodshed and the killing will continue. And on the other hand, if we talk about the government, our government, or the Afghan puppet government, is a corrupt government. Every day there are news of corruptions, but it just lasts for 1 day, or 1 or 2 days in the news, and then everybody forgets about it. The main reason for that is that because the high officials, including the president, his vice presidents, and the ministers, all of them are involved in the corruption. That's why when there is a case of corruption, they try to make it quiet so people don't talk about it, because if they bring or prosecute one corrupt person, of course he or she, especially he, will be talking about the other corruptions which is happening at the ministerial levels or other high officials. So everybody is just, they are trying to make everything quiet. And especially with this COVID-19 pandemic, which has added much calamity and bad situation in Afghanistan, because most of the people in Afghanistan, they are daily laborers, so they earn on daily basis, and then if there is a lockdown or things like that, of course they cannot earn their living. So it has further deteriorated the situation, and like 600 million US dollar was given in form of aid by the US and the European countries, and also I think Japan. They gave this money to Afghanistan to be used for fighting COVID-19. But most of this money was embezzled by the ministers and other high officials. Like at the start of the lockdown in June 2020, the previous health minister, he resigned from his post, and the main reason for that, because he was involved in the corruption. So the government didn't have any option but to make him resign from his position. But of course, with the new health minister, the things didn't change. He belongs to another jihadist faction, and then they continue with what was left from the previous minister. He continued with the corruption and theft of the money from the aid which was given to Afghanistan. And then I just want to go back that I said that the US troops are not leaving, and also the NATO troops, they will not be leaving in Afghanistan. And there are many reasons for that. First of all, they're earning a lot from Afghanistan. They're earning from the drugs, from the opium. They're earning a lot. Like according to the reports given by many prominent sources, they say that every year the US and the British troops, they're earning from 500 to 600 billion dollar from Afghanistan, and around $2 to $3 billion is returning back to Afghanistan. The rest of the money is used by the US and British troops. So this is one of their main source that they don't want to leave Afghanistan. And secondly, as Pep mentioned about the mines or the other precious stones and metals that we have in Afghanistan. For example, Helmand, which is one of the most insecure provinces of Afghanistan, or we can say which is one of the most insecure places on earth. And the reason for that is, first of all, we have uranium there, and the British and US troops, or they have their proxy forces in form of Taliban or other terrorist group which have control over the areas on the different districts of this province, and then they are extracting uranium from these areas. And then at the same time, the land for cultivating opium is best in Helmand. So this is another reason that they want to have control over the cultivation and over the trafficking of the opium in those areas. So these are the reasons. And of course, Afghanistan, with the geographical location which it has, like being with border with Iran, with China, with Russia, or even India and Pakistan and other countries, we say that Afghanistan is the heart of the Asia. So when US has its military forces here, it means that it has control over Asia. So this is another reason that they will not be leaving Afghanistan. And other point that I want to talk about the current prosecution of the Australian forces, I have to say that we believe that not only the Australian individual troops should be prosecuted, we believe that the government of Australia, especially the Prime Minister who was involved in sending the troops to Afghanistan, they should be prosecuted, because these crimes are committed not by individual. We believe that these crimes are committed by the system, by the government, because they are the ones who are raising these troops to be so much heinous and to be act so much crazy. So we believe that it is the government that should be prosecuted. And at the same time, we always say that we differentiate between the people of Australia or any other country and their government. When it comes to Australia, we thank people like Julian Assange or with John Pilger, who are the ones, or with the Green Left, who are the real voice, who are somehow our real voices. Like they were the ones who spoke about the crimes which were happening in Afghanistan. We are thankful to you and also to the figures like them who always spoke on our behalf and on the Afghan people behalf. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ubad, and we do agree these crimes are committed by the system, not by just individuals, and the whole system needs to be dismantled. And thank you so much for sharing with us. We're hoping you can stay a bit longer, because after the next two speakers, we'll have our discussion. And I'm sure there are a few people who would like to maybe ask you some questions. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. I will be there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ubad. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, who is Ronnie Kareni. Ronnie is a West Papua community representative. I'll hand it over to you, Ronnie. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you to all the other panelists and the organizers of this discussion. And before I begin, I also would like to take this opportunity to pay respect to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here where I walk and breathe, and would like to also say that the sovereignty never ceded. And as any First Nation indigenous people around the world, my people from West Papua as well, we continue to fight for our land rights and the dignity of our people. I would like to gonna touch on 2 points here in regards to Australia and Indonesia's defense relations. And this is in the bigger concept of the Lombok Treaty that was signed in 2006. And the second point to touch on the current legal framework under the Special Autonomy Law, which is ending in end of next year. And before touching on those 2 points, on the 1st of December, which was just yesterday, the people of West Papua marks the 59th anniversary of the flag raising, 61, like in 1961. And that was the period when under the Dutch administration, preparing West Papua to achieve its full independence in the 1970s. And so West Papua was already have the national flag, the Morning Star flag, national anthem as the Haitanaku Papua, or My Homeland Papua, and the Independent Republic of West Papua. And this comes around the time when Australia was very much an administrator to Papua New Guinea. It's the eastern part of the island of New Guinea. And of course, with Timor and Indonesia around that time already just proclaimed its independence. This is coming out of Second World War and the emergence or establishment of the United Nations. And so Indonesia proclaiming its independence, which was fully recognized in 1949. So at that stage, Australia was very much supporting the Dutch decolonization program, which Australia, New Zealand, and all the metropolitan powers at the time know that these are the non-self-governing territories. Sadly, it wasn't the case for West Papua. And after 4 attempts that Indonesia failed to secure a vote at the UN, they used the fictional concept of uti possidetis, and that is by force, to go into West Papua 19 days after West Papua raised that Morning Star flag. So for us, our right to self-determination was denied. And until now, as we speak, our legal and political status under international law and even under our customary law has not been challenged. And so that is the fight that the people of West Papua continues. And in its 59 years yesterday, we will continue to fight until that freedom or full independence is achieved. Over this period as well, we recognize that Australia shifted its position from supporting the Dutch into supporting Indonesia's push. And this comes in with the geopolitical as well as geostrategic interest and the wealth in the region, which both the Western allies, they know. And as Brother Abdul already mentioned about the scenarios, what's really currently happening in Afghanistan, West Papua is no different. The wealth of resources, the oil, the gas, the copper, which the U.S. Freeport-McMoran is signed an agreement in '67. This is way prior to the so-called Act of Free Choice in '69. They've already signed a 50-year deal, and that 50-year deal ends in 2017, which the government of Indonesia and the Freeport-McMoran have extended that agreement again for another 20 years. And we see that that's not in consultation or not pretty much in consideration of the people, the indigenous people of the land, and up until now. And that is the mindset that the Australian government, and we see they use the defense and geostrategic importance as the narrative to for the greater stability of this region. And that is what has been framed into this current, what is framed as the Special Autonomy Law. And this was introduced in 2001 after the incident with the Timor referendum, what happened in '99, when Indonesia brutally rampaged through Timor after that process of the people of East Timor is deciding the fate whether to be part of Indonesia or to be fully independent. Back then, that's already affecting both the security, the defense of both countries. And we can also see over time the defense is very volatile between Australia and Indonesia. In 2013, with the incident of the bugging of the then President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's wife's phone, and then with the incident in late 2017 to 2018 of the training material as well as the language within the training material, that the Indonesian top militaries and elites were not pleased with the language that was framed in the training material, and that really kind of like brought this volatility between those two countries. But what is really happening underneath that is that the voice of the people of West Papua is what both countries have agreed that should be remain silent. And anything that the people of West Papua resist against any forms of foreign investment or foreign capitalists and multinational companies that is coming in, it will be met by the security forces, both the TNI, which is the Indonesian Army, the National Army, and the Polri, the National Police. So both these institutions or the apparatus of the state, just in September, have been, like this is passed through the parliament under Jokowi's administration, that they were given the position to make decisions or to make calls when it comes to not only the border security, but when it comes to welfare, when it comes to education, when it comes to even COVID-19 situation. They are the ones that will be on the front foot and to go into those places, and at the same time to any conflict zones, which West Papua, Maluku, Aceh are the kind of the hot zones, to silence any of the resistance or uprising there. And Australia is heavily investing itself through this special autonomy that was introduced in 2001, ending in 2021. And that is the framework that now they've used it for training purposes. And Australia, through the federal police, has funded and trained, and even going in, especially the Detachment 88, to train them. And one thing that really kind of comes out of this training is that this death squad, so the anti-terrorist unit, even the COSTRA, the Kopassus, these strategic units, using those training instead of really carrying out the role or the defense role that they were going to do. They've been using those training to combat against peaceful activists, democracy activists throughout, not only in West Papua, but throughout places where they see that it will threaten the national interest. And West Papua is one of the hot zones within Indonesia and around that we've seen since Indonesia occupied West Papua, that the human rights atrocities, the conditions on the ground, the poverty, the level of maternity and infant mortality rate is high, and the poverty is high. Yet we know that the land is rich in those resources. And as of yesterday as well, the people of West Papua and within the leadership under the United Liberation Movement of West Papua, which I am the Pacific mission to the region and consults to Pacific regional state and non-state actors. And the United Liberation Movement yesterday declared our provisional constitution, and the provisional constitution is one is that we're not going to bow down to Indonesia's law and policies, and even under this the framework of this special autonomy, it's a statement that we are rejecting Indonesia's extension of the special autonomy, and also that the people of West Papua are now not going to bow down. And so we are taking the matters under the leadership of Benny Wenda, and our leaders within the movement are making this statement clearly now and calling for that to challenge the legal status of West Papua, of going back to that historical context. And so that's basically that. But particularly with the role of Australia with Indonesia is under this treaty, the Lombok Treaty, which both the Australian and Indonesian government signed after the arrival of 43 West Papuans to Australia in early 2006, and that caused some tension between the two countries. And since after that treaty has been signed, Australia has kept silent on human rights issues and conditions, especially as well. And this is one thing that Papuans, as well as the campaigns that are now emerging here in Australia. There is a campaign called Make West Papua Safe campaign. Is targeting the role of Australia, of the federal police, as well as ADF and SAS in their training and funding and aiding of those Indonesian agents. As I'm speaking, I've got some background, so I've got family as well, so you could hear. But yeah, just that Lombok Treaty, this is a campaign that is happening. You can check out those websites that we are now campaigning, and to put some support as well around this. And this campaign is basically to call on the Australian government to stop the using Australian taxpayers' money to fund and train the Indonesian death squads in West Papua. With that, I'll give it back to Chloe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. And please feel free to put the links to that campaign in the chat box so we can all access it and support you in the campaign. And thank you so much for sharing with us the struggle and the situation of the West Papuan people, the indigenous people of the land, and their fight for freedom to rise above Indonesia and Australia's tyranny. I'd like to now introduce our final speaker, Jacob Gretsch. Jacob is a renegade activist, a long-term anti-war activist. And as I mentioned before, both Jacob Gretsch and Pip Hinman are leaders in the anti-war movement here and were key figures in organizing the original anti-war protest to stop the invasion of Afghanistan. Thank you, Jacob. I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Wadawurrung land out here in Ballarat, where I'm helping to set up the Eureka Stockade Memorial tomorrow, land that has never been ceded. I'm going to get straight into it and touch on a few things lightly, and if people want more details or comments, then happy to answer questions. But just on the Brereton report, which is what this is about after all, it contains a little information, because it's heavily redacted, of 39 cases of murder by Australian SAS soldiers. And well, that's the headline anyway, because the Brereton report actually showed us a bit more. And the first thing that showed us it was more was the culture of the Australian Special Air Services Regiment. Because while the deaths, such as are quite gruesome, even though, and I've got to say, it was redacted to the public, and that was after the report's author, Paul Brereton, included the foreword stating this is already a report which is redacted to be able to be publicly released. The Department of Defence redacted it further. But even though the listings are gruesome, they really didn't tell us anything new, because while politicians and community leaders, they shake their heads and they cry crocodile tears about bad apples, the truth is they've known for quite some time of the not just the incidents of the reports, but of the role of the SAS. It's just to say the real surprise is that, to me, is that these murders, because that's what they are, have come out actually to see the light of day. And I'll get into why that's happened soon. Before the release of the Brereton report, did any one of you on this video link up here, any of us, really not know that Australian elite soldiers, or any elite national soldiers for that matter, routinely murder, torture, rape, abuse civilians and enemy soldiers alike during war? Did anyone, last week, last month, last year, last century, harbour any illusions that this isn't what war is, that have some concept of a just war? Now, I'm not talking about wars of necessity undertaken by people who have, been occupied and come under attack. There are times, and there's not only a need, but I guess an obligation to meet violence with violence, though no doubt, as war dehumanises everyone, wouldn't surprise me at even the purest just war cases. Some people did things they wouldn't write home about. But anyway, even if just amongst ourselves, let's recognise that there were no surprises in the knowledge that Australia's elite national troops commit murder and worse as part of their jobs. They're expected to. The Australian SAS, the Special Air Services, are not your average soldiers. They are recognised around the world in military circles as amongst the most successful and efficient fighting force there is. They're the best equipped, they're the best trained. They are what has been referred to by, when John Howard referred to Australia's military punching above its weight. One ex-SAS soldier, because, as part of my military research, I actually talked to people on the other side as well, told me years ago the difference between them and the US military, because he despised the US military every bit as much as I do, but for different reasons. This came up as a time when I was talking to soldiers about their feelings about working under US command when a couple of incompetencies came about. And I'm just going to switch over here and read his quote exactly. He said, "In a US deployment of 6, only 2 are trained to drive the Humvee. Only 2 are trained to navigate. Only 2 are trained to use the specialist weapons. And none of them can do a running repair in a truck if it's needed. In our mob," you use that word, "in our mob, all of us can do everything, with one hand tied behind our backs, doing anything else we need to while getting a blowjob off a local. We're soldiers, they're just machinery operators." Now, a lot of Australians would find that something to be proud of, I guess, that we're, that there's that kind of mindset that's exemplified by that statement. And it's that kind of mindset that comes out of the Brereton report. Not any individual murder, as heinous as each and every one of them is. That mindset of elitism, of being the best, of being able to do what they needed to do when they needed to do it. And the SAS regiment, the SASR, they've been acting in promoting Australian foreign policy. This is what they do. They promote Australian foreign policy, but whatever needs necessary. In every theatre of war since their unit was formed in the late 50s, modelled on the British SAS. Though it's often, difficult to say exactly where they've been and what they've done, because they're also about the most highly secretive combat unit in the Western world. They were involved in the Borneo campaign against Malaysia, or in support of Malaysia. They were more than likely a major part of Australia's clandestine operations in the Indonesians' militaries and Suharto's purge of PKI militants in the 60s. They were, of course, in Vietnam. But also, members of the SASR are often seconded to both British and, more often, US military, where we don't know where they are, what they're doing. They might be over there training them. They might be over there being trained. They might be in somewhere. They might have been there when, the US Marines took bin Laden. I don't know. They could be anywhere. They are recognised as elite soldiers, and they're rented out to our friends and allies as elite soldiers. There was a bit of a break with the British SAS in the mid-2000s, I think it was 2004, in Iraq, because the British SAS were unconvinced that the US-led plans in Iraq were not possibly war crimes, and they refused to take part. Now, you dig what I'm saying there? The British SAS said these are possibly constitute war crimes and we are not taking part. But the Australians, of course, fill their role with gusto. Remember Jim Molan was actually in control of all the logistics for the US-led Second Battle of Fallujah, the massacre of Fallujah in 2004. So there should be no doubt that war crimes are par for the course for the SAS. The real revelations in the Brereton report, in reading between the lines and seeing how this culture of impunity is just accepted as normal by the Australian press, by the Australian politicians. No one has spoken about this culture. And when you look at the reports that led to the Brereton report, there's nothing new about the allegations of war crimes being committed in the war in Afghanistan. WikiLeaks release of the Iraq and the Afghan war diaries, war logs in 2010 detailed many similar atrocities. Our government knew about them. Our Prime Minister at the time, Julia Gillard, knew about them. She was aware of the Afghan war logs in its entirety, and I know that for a fact because I had it all printed out and I put it on her desk. She knew that. But instead of looking into any Australian involvement, she decided to shoot the messenger and supported the US actions against WikiLeaks publisher Julia Assange, who's still in Belmarsh prison, by the way, facing 175 years if he's extradited to the United States. Belmarsh has had 32 COVID deaths, 600 active cases at the moment. They're trying to kill him. But that's not what we're talking about today. WikiLeaks also, of course, released a lot of diplomatic cables, which exposed what the Australian government really thought about Indonesia in West Papua. Cables, which the lawyers working for West Papuan independence movement have described as invaluable in their cases against the Indonesian government and the Indonesian military. If you're interested in following up on any of that, you can read about them in a little book released just yesterday called A Secret Australia, which goes through a whole lot of WikiLeaks exposés edited by Felicity Ruby and the ABC's Peter Chrono. Now, the Afghan and the Iraq war logs led directly to the other reports about Australian atrocities in Afghanistan. David McBride told me he was inspired by the WikiLeaks leaks when he leaked documents about war crimes in Afghanistan. And of course, David's leaks have led directly to the Brereton Report. And I think the other thing that Ratzer mentioned here, and I want to talk about for a minute, because all too often we talk about facts and figures and laws, but how the hell do you get young Australian men, our men, to do things like this? How do you turn a child, kids? I mean, I've been a youth worker. My ex-partner was a teacher. These are kids we work with. How do you turn a child into a state-sponsored child murderer? Well, to start with, and this might surprise people, it shouldn't, but it might surprise people, the SAS has an extraordinarily high percentage of members who are alumni of Australia's most elite private high schools. Not exclusively, of course. There's no such thing as a class system in Australia, and working class kids can and do occasionally get to positions of power in government, industry and military. But the fact that there is such a high number of private schoolboys in the SAS has got to say something about their sense of privilege, doesn't it? And, of course, of their ability to both be brutalised and to brutalise. And the public school boys who make it, the non-elite boys who make it into the SAS through sheer effort and physical presence, are no doubt wanting to keep up with their private school comrades. The SAS do not wear rank. They do not address each other with rank. They address each other by first name. They can grow beards and have their hair long. Other uniform requirements of the military don't apply to them. Amongst themselves, they're treated as equals. And this pseudo-equality is a big factor in ensuring the mafia-like code of silence and complicity among its members. This sense of elitism, I've got to say, doesn't end in the SAS. It stays beyond a soldier's deployment. Ex-SAS soldiers are sought after by security and arms companies and even government departments here in Australia and police forces. And taking case in point, a copper who shot a young man in Yuendamu last year, Kumanai Walker. Copper's name was Zachary Rolfe. Now, while it's impossible to know if he was with the SAS, he was decorated and fighting in the same area at the same time as the Brereton Report incidents are about, and I can't find his name listed amongst other battalions who were there at the same time. And when your name's not listed amongst other battalions and you're there, you're either SAS or you're ACIS. I put him on SAS. He was in the Northern Territory Police's elite immediate response team. He wasn't just another copper. He was decorated even as a civilian for showing callous disregard for orders in his own health when he rescued a woman in the flooded Finke River. And, you know, he showed disregard. In raiding Kumanai Walker's house when he did, he actually went against a plan and against orders, and which is also a hallmark of the SAS. He shot him in the thigh, which is like shooting in the femoral artery is an SAS hallmark. Even after, you know, two of the shots happened after Kumanai Walker was in custody. So what I'm saying is here, the SAS, when we're talking about the SAS and these atrocities in the Brereton Report and their atrocities in Afghanistan, they don't start in Afghanistan and they don't end in Afghanistan. Now, there have been calls, and Chloe mentioned and others mentioned the calls to disband the SAS. I don't necessarily disagree, but I fear it's just window dressing. All it will mean is that there would need to be another elite killing squad under another name. I don't care if it's called SAS or TBT or what the hell. We need to address the culture of violence, of impunity, of elitism. And I'll get to that in a minute. The second point I want to quickly touch on is our politicians' response to the Brereton Report and to the memes circulated by the Chinese official that was mentioned this week, with an Australian soldier slitting the kid's throat. Scott Morrison and a raft of others from the Libs and the ALP have released statements showing that they're even more outraged by the meme than they were by the murders themselves. Scott Morrison actually went so far as to say he is proud of each and every Australian that dons the Australian military uniform. Now, this must mean he's proud of the murderers, even after he's had to report. He is and always has been, and he is and always will be aware that when elite Australian forces go into another country to protect US corporate interests like they do in Afghanistan, or into another country to protect Australian corporate interests like they train in Capacus troops in West Papua, they will always do whatever needs to be done. And I'm reluctant to say what may change the situation other than a total overthrow of Western capitalism, but I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime, so I hope I'm wrong. One thing that would have a mitigating effect on things like this is to change the War Powers Act, that currently lets the PM, just by speaking to his Security Council, his Security Cabinet, decide when we go into war. There needs to be a change to at least ensure that the decision be debated publicly in Parliament, and at the very least remove any politician's ability, indeed any Australian's ability, to turn around when things like the Brereton report are released about other countries next year, the year after, in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, to stop any possibility of them being able to say, I didn't know, and be able to hold them accountable for their decisions. And that way, at least, we may be optimistic again, but may expose the concept, we're talking about individual wars here, Afghanistan, West Papua, but there's one constant war. And constant war is what is happening here. We in the West don't want to win a war in Afghanistan. I'm sorry to our Afghani comrades, but we don't want to win the war there. All we want to do is make sure that the war keeps happening. If we win it, we'd be responsible for rebuilding the infrastructure. We'd be responsible for reparations. We'd be responsible for providing education, food, medical equipment, electricity, water, whatever. We don't want to win it. All we want is to provide access to resources and, of course, keep the largest security military corporations going, which gels the war in Afghanistan, West Papua, with the war at home, taking resources away from the poorest in the community and giving them to the masters of war who run the biggest arms companies and technology companies, because technology companies are arms companies, the biggest companies in the world. And here's my final takeaway from the report. Officially, Australia is there because of fundamentalist terrorism, because of the Taliban, which the US created to oppose Russia in northern Afghanistan in 1979, whatever. But look, I'm not a violent man. I'm a peace activist. But if foreign troops came here to Melbourne, to Ballarat, to Australia, and slit my 14-year-old kid's throat, if they took my father out, shot him, and when he didn't die, bludgeoned him and kicked him to death, to a pulp, you would find that me and all my mates and all my relatives would be amongst the most radicalized people on earth. And who'd blame us? They're creating the conflict they're claiming to fight against. So I'll close by saying the only hope we do have in addressing the war economy, in our support of people of Afghanistan and in Papua, and of course in places like Iraq and Palestine and the 40-odd countries where Australians have mining interests in Africa, is to keep speaking the truth. If all the politicians and if all the Australian people knew the criteria for war, knew the methods for war, knew what we did when we were in these places, I'd like to believe they'd put an end to it. As a friend of mine, Julian Assange, once said, if wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by the truth. So thanks for that. I'm done.
Thank you, Jacob, for sharing your thoughts with us. We really appreciate your time, and please stick around so we can ask you questions in discussion time in a few minutes. And thank you to all our speakers tonight. And we welcome anyone here who would like to ask a question. Just use your chat box, or you can even use your mic and just put your name down in the chat and I'll call your name out. Or if you choose not to speak using your mic, I can still, you can just type a question and I'll read it out. But just while you're thinking about what questions to ask, I just want to make some quick announcements. The event is being hosted by Socialist Alliance, and you can find out more about us through our website or Facebook page. You will also see us out on the street as part of different actions, as we are active in the many environmental and social justice movements and campaigns of the oppressed. We also want to let everybody know about the upcoming online forum, The Climate Emergency and Indigenous Land Practice with Bruce Pascoe, author of bestseller Dark Emu. Please come along to this important event and also share the event around. This will be Saturday, December the 5th at 4 p.m., which is hosted by Green Left. Also, if you are interested in becoming a Green Left supporter, please consider getting a subscription. Green Left is our wonderful media for eco-socialist action. It's a not-for-profit activist media. There is no paywall, but we do need a bit of money to keep it going, and subscriptions start at just $5 a month. So we really appreciate any support. And lastly, for the people in Melbourne, or even if you're not in Melbourne, you are invited to. We are having our end of year celebration happening this Sunday, the 6th of December from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. at Coburg Lakes. It's a barbecue. It's a COVID safe event hosted by the Sue Bolton Moreland team and Socialist Alliance. And we'll be celebrating the win for Sue Bolton's third term as Socialist Alliance councillor for the city of Moreland. So make sure you can come along. It will be good to see everybody again and all the volunteers who helped us with that campaign. So if anybody would like to ask any questions, or there was some great comments coming through. Oh, I see Bob had a question. Bob, if you just want to unmute your mic.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
This is not so much a question, but a statement. I just want to point out that the current revelations about the atrocities committed by the SAS, very often the way the media is portraying it is that it's a recent event, but actually, Australian Army, going right back to the pre-Federation colonial armies, have always carried out atrocities. Of course, in the 19th century, it was mainly against the Indigenous Australians. And the century was only a few weeks old when the first Australian Army atrocity emerged during the South African Boer War, when you've probably all heard of Breaker Morant. He slaughtered not only Boer prisoners, but he also slaughtered a German missionary, and he was court-martialed and executed, not because he did such a dreadful act, simply because the German government took exception to one of its own citizens being shot and threatened to intervene on the side of the Boers unless the British took some action. Of course, the British used Breaker Morant as a scapegoat to cover up their own atrocities in South Africa at the time, committed by not just British territorial troops, but also by Australian soldiers, Aotearoan soldiers, Canadian soldiers. They all committed atrocities, and right throughout, even in the First and Second World Wars, there were atrocities committed. The Australian Army, even in Papua New Guinea during the Second World War, even committed executions and atrocities against native Papuans, not because they were not because they collaborated with the Japanese, but simply because they were a bit outspoken towards Australian colonialism. And of course, we have in Vietnam, where it was just virtually a weekly occurrence where Australian troops, in cooperation with the CIA and other American elements, would torture NLF and PRG prisoners. So that's about all I have to say. I just wanted to point out that, in fact, it is not a new phenomenon. It is, in fact, ingrained into the whole basis of the Australian Army and Australian imperialist adventures abroad at the orders of the bigger imperialist powers.
Thanks everybody for joining this live stream. We're going to finish up the live stream here. I would like to remind you before we go, if you haven't not already a supporter of GreenEft, please go to the GreenEft website and become a supporter. It's the most important way to support our project. You can also support us on Patreon. The information is in the video description. Please share this video, give it a like and a thumbs up. Well, thanks again for joining us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.